Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Dr. Reverend Stephen Horne. Stephen, it's great to get you on. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and it's wonderful to get on. It's particularly nice to be invited onto a podcast that I listen to.
Oh,
Uh,
great. Oh,
so,
that's
so
great.
yeah. When I got the message, I was ever so pleased.
Well, Stephen, I don't want to undermine your position or who you are at all, but I've been very blessed. I've had some very famous people on. You might not be in the top 10, let's be honest. But tell the listeners about you. I mean, one of the joys for me is having people who perhaps aren't on a national level famous,
Hmm.
but have still got interesting stories. And when I saw your story, I was most interested. But tell us a bit about where you are and your role at the moment.
Sure. So I do have a bit of an interesting story, and one day I think it might all go into another book. But the long and short of it, so my CV is that I was a landscape gardener from about the age of 14 or 15 after leaving school at a very early age. I eventually at some point went into the police and did some associated work with that afterwards. And at one point I decided I wanted to raise that glass ceiling, so I was going to go to university as a mature student and went on from there to study theology and religious studies, which wasn't easy because I only had two GCSEs to my name at the time. It turned out that academia was my thing. I should have maybe listened more at school. And I ended up walking out with a first class honours degree in theology, except I also walked out with a scholarship, which was amazing. So I was able to study and do a PhD. I did my PhD in a subject called traveller theology, which it's kind of what it says on the tin. If you think Roma, gypsies, travellers, often sort of for various reasons sort of get lumped together. Um, Obviously, anyone who's a Christian has their own theology, but in terms of a concise, single source, for example, that says, this is kind of like the roots of traveller or gypsy theology. There've been lots of little writings, but no one ever wanted to be brave enough to give a gypsy or a traveller the pen, so to speak, and so their entire history had been written by others. I have a sort of a mixed heritage background on my father's side of the family, Romany Gypsies. I thought, well, I could maybe put something together. And I mentioned this to my university, did it for my dissertation in my undergraduate degree. And they said afterwards, here you go, can you turn it into a PhD? And so it became the first traveller theology anywhere. And my little claim to fame is that I then became the first person of Romany Gypsy heritage in the UK, and currently I think the only person of Romany Gypsy heritage in the UK and possibly beyond to hold a PhD in theology. So you feel like you're breaking ground at times, but you also feel, it's like living on an island on your own. It's a bit of a castaway situation. So there's that side of things, and from there, I've gone into lay ministry and then went on for training towards ordained ministry. I studied at Ridley Hall in Cambridge and started my curacy last year. But I was also in the national press last year, as there's always another side to the story. But it's always nice when it's someone who's wearing a collar and you're in the national press for a good reason or something positive. And they caught wind of the fact that whilst I was doing my PhD and possibly a little bit beyond that as well, um, I was also wrestling in wrestling rings around the UK, doing some stuff in the US as well. Also, mostly being a referee, to be fair, but I was also wrestling, and it is what you're thinking of. Think the WWE, WWF, kind of over the top theatrics, still chairs, all of that kind of thing. So it's been an interesting ride.
And people are thinking, well, why have you got this guy on? He's really dull. No, it's incredible. It's incredible, Stephen. There's so much there, isn't there? The first thing, what was it about school that kind of meant you left with two GCSEs? Because it sounds like you were quite naturally academic, but something's gone on at school. What's happened?
Yeah, I mean, culturally for me, anyway, education in the typical sense that I say we, in a collective sense, in this country might understand education. We say education, we instantly think of school or university or college. Culturally, where I was from, that wasn't an education. My education was learning how to, um, you know, prepare a garden or something, build a patio or a wall or a water feature or something from scratch. I was out working on sites with my brothers from 13, 14 kind of thing. That was partly a response to the poverty that we were suffering as a family. So my brothers had moved out by this point, but my mum's single parent and um, absolute star. And she did what she could, but obviously in those situations, we're talking like the days before certain assistance like universal credit, that sort of thing. There was, wasn't really much available at all. So it was really, really tough. And so if anything, I would be going, I could go to school and be hungry and not be able to concentrate for that and for various other reasons that would come along later on in life. But it was that, or I could go to work with my brothers for a day or two and actually have some food, and we could, I could support my mum as well in that respect. I mean, it goes all the way back. We were because of who my mum was perceived to be, and I should make I want to emphasize that my mum isn't a gypsy or traveller. But because of who we were perceived to be, there was lots and lots of trouble pretty much wherever we were living when I was very young. So we ended up actually staying at my granddad's, I'm going to say accommodation, when I was around about 5 or 6 before moving to a back to an estate again. So my granddad was in the military. So we had to effectively be homeless for a period of time before we could go and live with them. So it was a lot of unsettlement. School kind of like didn't seem a priority in that respect. It wasn't, and it wasn't in my vocabulary either. When I got to 18, I've got my best friend was going off to uni. A couple of other friends were going off to uni. I didn't even question what university was because I genuinely didn't know what a university was for or what it was about. I just knew that some of my friends were going off there. I was more interested in what I was looking at, like military, that kind of thing. So it was, yeah, it's, I mean, it's one of those eye openers thinking, 18, had no idea what uni was. 10 years later, I was in one and on my way to earning a doctorate. So.
I think there's something for us all to learn in this, Stephen. I'm interested to know what your reflection of that time is, and I suppose from the outside looking in on a traveling community, maybe we see the community as a community that's not geared for academia, where reading and writing's not kind of um, in the market in the game really, and it's more about using creative ways of earning a living and making way and surviving a real kind of entrepreneurship, isn't there, in the traveling community? How do you reflect on it now? Now you're a grown man.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. I mean, it is an evolving situation in many traveller communities, to be fair, and many Romany Gypsy communities. And I do want to sort of make that distinction. But there's many people with successful businesses. And we do have a certain amount of what we class as conventional education. Like I say, it's a changing situation where um, years ago, for example, you could go onto a site, and you've only got to have the tools to be able to do it, to be able to do whatever job it was you was doing. And then, of course, they brought in things like CSCS cards. And for those listeners who might not know what a CSCS card is, it's effectively it's a small license card which says you've done a certain amount of training. So you can go and work on a building site. It's like a safety card, effectively. It says that you're safe to work there. But of course, to be able to do that, you don't just get that. You've got to go through part of the education system. You've got to go through the college and things like that. And so, before there was no reward to going through that, or at least, not necessarily perceived to be. But now, there's certain red tape that has to be adhered to. So there are more and more gypsies and travellers going through the conventional education system. And I should point out that there is also a growing number of gypsies and travellers with degrees, with doctorates, but taking up, high professions, if we want to call it that, in this country. It's it's something I'm deeply passionate about because I've seen education from every I think pretty much from every angle, and I appreciate it. I appreciate I've got the The doctorate's up there, behind me. For those who aren't seeing this on screen, the doctorate's up there. But you know what? Just out of sight over there, I've got a picture of me and my brothers, and in another picture, I've got a picture of me and my best friends, and in another one, with me and all my family. And the best educations I've ever have come from them. Um, and I've obviously, obviously I'm wearing this collar. The church has fed into that, but I've typically found that it's actually, to make it more accurate, my faith has fed into my education to drive me to learn for what's happening next. So when I was 14, what was important was feeding my family. A bit of paper wouldn't do that at that particular time. So my education needed to be in response to the situation I found myself in. It was a different situation 15 years later, and things were evolving. And I think we often we can in this country conflate, it's almost like the golden calf. Education is the golden calf. It's something that will take us to places, and if we don't have it, we're perhaps looked down on. And I really think we really need to approach education differently in that respect. And recognizing that actually we all learn differently, we all respond differently. And actually, I mentioned the picture of my family because my family and my children have taught me more than any degree ever could.
Mm.
Um, and
It's
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but ask the question. Then, obviously, people who know me and my podcast know that I've been banging the drum about working class vocations, and you are the perfect living example, embodiment that working class people can be academic. But where does that leave you in terms of the role of you're a curate. So for people who aren't familiar with a curate, Stephen's in his formative years as an ordained minister. Just how does that, what you've just said, speak into the bigger project? Have you seen, or is the model different maybe to when is it still continuous academic learning, or is it context? Just explain that, Stephen.
Okay, so I mean, to make it a little bit awkward with my own training is I don't like using the word fast track because it seems to devalue things, but my own training felt quite fast tracked. So most people would study for you go through the discernment process to decide whether this is the right path for yourself, and if it is, then you begin your ordination training. Most people do 2 to 3 years. Occasionally, someone does 1 year, and that depends on certain circumstances. I was told by my bishop that I am doing 1 year because she wants me out there. But that was because I was coming into it with a PhD and a degree, both from
Mm.
theology and some other things sort of behind me as well. So because that's the thing is the training programs for most soon to be priests is heavily on the academic side. Now it was interesting because I'd already come into it with the academic side. My year did consist of some study. So the other day I received my little bit of paper through the door. I got my certificate in higher education for theology and ministry or something, and that's lovely. That's great. But it, even the theological colleges that I visited before deciding which one was the right one for me, when I sat down with their educational leads, they were kind of like, what, literally, what do we do with you? Because you've already got the bits that we would throw at you effectively. And this made them respond. It meant that my time of formation, so for those not familiar with the terms, when you go and do your training, it consists of certain elements, and overall we use the word formation, so you're being formed into the shape of a minister, of a priest, or whatever role it is that you're going to do. And I was uh, I was told that formational side would be, much more present than the educational side because I'd done that, and you could see them sort of scratching around, like, what does that look like? And for me, it meant going on a couple of different placements, and having a little bit more time to work with those within the theological community that I was studying and living alongside for that year. Um, it effectively meant that I got to do ministry and do it more proactively, which was, without them knowing that that was the approach that I was going to be taking, was absolutely perfect for someone from a working class background. In my own, this isn't to say that people from a working class background can't do education. I've kind of shown that actually you can if you just, you have people at the right time and in the right moment and in the right environment. But
It's really interesting though, isn't it? Because you said, you were effectively fast tracked because you got the certificates, which is
yes,
quite an act, which for me is the challenge I would say is, what about the guy who turns up without the certificates or the lady without the certificates who's
yeah,
got 30 years, I don't know, in management experience or, are
yeah,
they, and I think this is the challenge for the church at the moment, isn't it? Is all, how can we make those two look the same but be
yes,
different?
yeah. And me personally, it's you. I mean, you do obviously you need there is a huge value because at heart I would consider myself a theological educator. So in my heart now, there's so much value and depth and richness that we can get from those studies. I think the problem is that we place them maybe at the wrong moment. I get, for example, 1 day a week in my curacy for study day. Now, we do have a study program in the diocese. Typically, because we're in a very busy parish, that looks like writing sermons on, for that day. I don't get much of a study day. I think if I think there's in terms of like an apprenticeship model, and I know that term's been, sort of thrown around a little bit. I think I got an incredible amount of value from doing the placements and the more practical side of things when I was doing my training than I did from the study. Now I had one of my modules was a self-directed study, which was great for me because I've done a lot of extensive research before. I knew how to lead my own study. I actually think that model, that type of education, could be adapted so that people can learn and study at their own pace, and then we can actually carry on that side. I know we call it IME2, which again, for those not listening, is your training sort of carries on whilst you do your curacy. Um, but it's on a different level. It's more. I'm tempted to use the word holistic, but I think that's probably incorrect. It's not quite as pressing, which makes way in some way for your curacy post. But I actually think that, well, maybe we need to rethink how we do curacies, that that educational side can take up part of the um part of the training in curacy. In fact, maybe curacies get slightly longer. I mean, I can hear the purse strings going, oh, from the coffers are getting tight there. Maybe we can make curacy slightly longer and the theological education side of things slightly shorter. Because I found so much value in actually, again, being in placements, because you can study and read all you want. But there is nothing like sitting with someone and praying with them, or sitting there and actually going through the service, or going through and doing ministry on the streets. Um, when Jesus came and called the disciples, he didn't call qualified men. He went up to people who had potential, and they went straight into the ministry, and they did their learning whilst they went along, and they learned from their mistakes. They didn't have to be almost like pre-ready for their training. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for the education that I've been able to go through. I'm so grateful that I'm able to say, "Oh, I've got this PhD." Great, brilliant. But you know what? No one wanted to listen to me or give me a time of day until I had that. And that's the difference, because someone can come into the church uh, and have had an established career. And let's call a spade a spade, coming from maybe perhaps a very middle class um, position, and or maybe they've just been in Church of England their whole life and they're like, now's the time to go into ministry. This isn't any slight on them whatsoever, but just want to highlight this so that people can see where there is a privilege in this, because people can come in and they'll go through the process and then they'll be able to be sort of taken on in that respect. I had many, many questions from many people when I was entertaining like the idea of going into ministry before I had any qualifications. Even though actually from other churches I'd been in for years, I'd had people saying from a very young age, speak, to speaking words of knowledge, or having a prophecy or something like that. It was quite an evangelical sort of free open churches that I was at beforehand, and which is markedly different from the church that I'm in now and the tradition I sort of like follow now. But people were basically saying, I recognize that there is a calling in you. And for me, the calling was just to be with people, to go out there, to spread the gospel. And the only people who would listen were in the churches I was in before. And then, of course, I encountered the beast that is the Church of England, and it was a whole different game. And people again, people aren't watching us on the camera. They start seeing the tattoos. I speak so much more. You wouldn't believe it, but I speak so much more eloquently than I did a couple of years ago. So, but it's that's just the nature of what it is. So yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. And now you're ordained. How was getting the dog collar, if any, changed your life for you? Has it been a big shift?
Yes, yeah, it has in some ways. I mean, I was fortunate enough to before coming into this post, I was working as a lay minister, as a what they call it, an Ignite mission enabler. I know mission enabler is perhaps a title we've used sort of around the country. Ignite was a particular I want to say it was initially a project, but it's now something much bigger than that, that started in the Diocese of Canterbury, which was effectively a church for people who don't do church. And we would meet on a Thursday morning, and my congregation consisted of people who'd just come out of prison, people who were just about to go back to prison, mostly addicts. In fact, 80 to 90% of the people there are addicts. And this was this was my bread and butter ministry at the sharp end of the stick, and that was 2 years. So that set me up nicely coming into this. So I wasn't too unfamiliar, but of course you come into this, and like I say, I'm sitting here now in a rectory, in a big house which is about probably 4 times the size of my previous house, where I have to rely on other people coming around to fix things because I'm not allowed to fix things necessarily. It's very, very strange. The pace is very different as well. Obviously it's a lot more administration, that kind of thing. It is different.
And what is
But
the context, Stephen, of where you are, just for people who are thinking, oh, where are you? What's the horizon like outside your front door?
so I am in a place that is it's one of the largest parishes per capita in the country. We have it's a large town that's actually then got several villages around which are classed as part of the town. If we take into account all of the villages, we're looking at about 120,000 people. And we've got 7 churches in our parish. So that's a lot of people per church. Unfortunately, those numbers don't quite translate into the churches. And we're also kind of stuck in that position where this town is, a third of this town, half of this town are extraordinarily wealthy. We're on the high speed link to London, so we get a lot of people commute, move here so they can commute into London each day. But there's also an awful lot of deprivation. One of the highest sort of poverty scales. Certainly, like I say, I'm down in Kent. Certainly down in Kent, one of the most impoverished areas as well. So it really affects a lot of things. I can look out my window now and I can see a couple of houses which I the people, they're doing all right for themselves. If I go literally a minute down the end of the street, there's an estate where there's an extraordinary amount of deprivation.
Where are you, Steve? Where's the town?
We're Ashford Town. Ashford, yeah. So the train station is Ashford International. We used to have the Eurostar turning up, but it doesn't do it anymore. Yeah, we're down in the Ashford Town parish.
It's interesting now because there's quite a lot of people who I know a friend of mine is a guy called Luke Lorna who he lives in a works in an area that is reasonably affluent, but like yourself has got these pockets of poverty and deprivation, and it almost kind of it skews the actual reality of of what's going on and impacts their applications for grants and everything else. So there are some big challenges for the church in terms of tackling these kind of um, areas which are. I mean, we've got areas of wealth here, but predominantly we've got areas of poverty. Yeah. And Stephen, how do you as a new curate to the church, and like you say, when this beast of a machine, this huge institution that what you said at the beginning was so refreshing, because how often do we get good news Church of England stories in the press? And in recent months and years, it's been, if it's not been safeguarding, then it's been the Archbishop of Canterbury. If it's not been that, it's been living in love and faith. Do you feel as a curate these are kind of things that you should engage with and your parish should engage with, or what's the parish view on this? Is it something that should be left to others? I mean, I have I wouldn't say the pleasure really, but I have the responsibility of being on General Synod, and then I do sometimes feel there are two parallel universes going on here. There's the politics going on at the highest level, and the reality in the parish is something very different. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in strategic management briefly beforehand, so I totally get the national perspective and how that's important to be looking out and be looking ahead to anticipate problems. So we're not so reactionary. But the problem is when these stories break in the news, or obviously when they're quite often misconstrued and misrepresented, actually it's the churches on the front line, the parishes like ours, have to, are forced to work in a reactionary way. We're scraping for details sometimes. You're hoping that someone's been watching Synod. Now, I do have an interest in that, so I for my sins, I do sit there and watch Synod as I'm writing other sermons and what have you. But um, it's difficult. So, for example, some of the safeguarding issues that obviously arose recently. One of our churches many years ago had some issues with a safeguarding concern, and for the small congregation there, that obviously, like many other churches up and down the breadth of the country, that invoked memories and pain and hurt, and so we were forced to address that. And the trouble is, it's opening up an old wound, isn't it? When actually on the front line, our diocese has been doing some amazing work, in terms of safeguarding, and our parish is so hot on it. And our churches, I want to be able to say, as much confidence as I can, that they are really safe and welcoming, comfortable places, and not just physically, spiritually. And I think that's quite important, because that element often gets neglected in these conversations. We focus sometimes on the grit and the sensationalism from the news stories, and that can distract us from, is there someone leading their church in a way that's really not spiritually helpful or healthy for people? So, but that we're able to keep, our fingers on the pulse there, and it can be, a struggle when you hear something breaking news, you're like, here we go again, and like we're going to have something else to deal with here. But I think also, we're all dealing with it as well when it affects things like numbers. And it's not that you suddenly see 20 less people that week, but that it means you're probably not going to see 20 more people the next year. And so, I mean, there's what's the answer to that? I do believe in small changes, and that can make a huge difference, unless of course it's someone telling me to turn my light bulb off, and then China's admitting all of the pollution under the sun. It's different though for ministry, because I stand firm on the fact that if 12 people can change the entire course of history because of the words of one man, then what I say, what the minister down the road there says, what the next one says, what they do, there's more than 12 of us. And if they can change the world, and they didn't have the technology and the ways to communicate that we do, then we can change the world. And if God's involved, and God is involved, then it doesn't matter what decisions are made. It doesn't matter who's pulling the strings. It doesn't matter what the budgets are. If God wants to win, God's going to win. And I hold firm to that faith, because I know the God that I serve, because the God who I serve is the same God that spoke to me when I was 7 and 8 years old and I had no food, and I was crying because I was hungry, and I was hearing God's voice saying it's going to be okay. And then there would be meals turning up. I knew that every single part of every step that I'd gone through, that God turned up. And often it was never on my timing, but it was always on God's timing. And I realized that none of his timing, it never made sense. So the only option I had was to have faith, because what's the other option? You either dismiss God or you say, okay, well, I'm just going to keep believing. And so call me naive. I thought by this age I would have got here and said, you know what? I'm just going to be realistic about this. Revival isn't coming, blah, blah, blah. The rest of it, it's like, oh, but once you get hold of God, you really get hold of God and you touch Christ's hem. It's not just words. It's you cannot let go of that. And so I thank God that He has placed a fire in me, which is nothing but Him. Um, I can't ignore that. And so reactions to what goes on, it's like I said, we have to be reactionary most of the time. We can be proactive, in sense, going back to sort of what you were saying. So things like LLF. We are a huge parish. We've only got the 7 churches within the Ashford town parish itself, but we've got a very broad and diverse range of thoughts and feelings on different issues, and LLF is unsurprisingly one of those things where there's broad views on those issues. And again, it's like, people are just waiting for information sometimes. We can answer concerns, we can try and do what we can do, but there's only so much we can do when we're reliant on policy. So one thing we can always be in control of is how much we love on people, how much we declare Christ in the pulpit, how much we open those doors to people, and how much we serve the communities. Those things we can do, and I don't think there's much else that's really more important than those.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good way to end the podcast, Stephen, because I don't think Jesus calls us to get churches full. He doesn't call us to put bums
Mm.
on seats. I think he calls us to change lives. And what you were saying, and I don't usually mention my book, but it evokes memories of the closing chapter of my book. It's about making differences to one person. If you make a difference to one person, and it's done through an authentic love of Jesus Christ, then you've done your job, and that's and I'm sure that that will carry you forward. Stephen, it's been really great to chat to you. Just quickly promote. You've got the book, haven't you? Quickly promote your book and tell people where they might be able to find it and get signed copies, etc.
Right. So my I've got a couple of books, but I'll just stick with the one today. So my book that came out, I think it's 2 years ago now, Gypsies and Jesus, a Traveller Theology. And again, it's through reviews from others. I said it's the most concise and the only concise. I've got it here actually because I'm referencing my own work today. Traveller theology that there is at the moment. If it's not just, I want to stress that whilst this is a really concise way of understanding gypsies and travellers, the history and so forth, and the theology, that actually there is a theology concurrent in this that anyone can take and learn from. So I do encourage people to engage with that. They can, of course, pick it up from any good bookstore. And it's they do it in this lovely hardback, which was nice of them. So it's available through DLT Books, but again, you can buy that anywhere. And I think the going rate for it at the moment is about £19.99 or something like that. So in terms of signed copies, um, invite me along to your church or your cathedral or your event, and as long as you pay my train fare, I'll bring some copies and they can have them.
Yeah, and check Stephen out. He's on social media. You're on X, aren't you? And
Yeah, yes, yeah, on X and on Instagram, and whilst it might still be up there, if you search Stephen Horne ITV, you'll even be able to see a little 3 or 4 minute video thing of some of the work that I'm doing here in Ashford, from the wrestling to gym chaplaincy.
Fabulous. I'm just glad you didn't come on the podcast in your trunks. It'd have been a first.
It would be a first one. Yeah, I didn't want to scare you.
Well, Stephen, thanks for coming on, and I hope people have enjoyed this chat with Stephen. If you have, do check out the Godcast. There are literally hundreds of interviews there, lots of theologians, people from media, from sport, from entertainment. But for now, Stephen, thank you for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.